Good evening. Just a little business meeting. Our next meeting is going to be on March 7th. And it's going to be at the Jefferson Educational Society. And it will be Tom Atkins, and his topic is going to be Erie's Humbling Weather. A very good title. Tonight we are going to have Karen Eisenhart. She's from Edinburgh. She's a professor there of geoscience, and she grew up in the Harrisburg area. And she will be talking about redistricting. Her talk is the redistricting reform in Pennsylvania, why it's needed and how to support it. Karen.
Thanks for my water here. Good evening.
Hi. Good evening.
So I want you to know, I'm here as a volunteer for Fair Districts Pennsylvania. Fair Districts is a program that was begun initially by the League of Women Voters in 2016, and it's associated with Fair District Reform. It's a nonpartisan group. As you probably are aware, the League of Women Voters has been around forever, and they're just interested in protecting democracy and democratic principles. So I want to talk to you about redistricting reform in Pennsylvania and why it's needed. I was given this, but I didn't practice with it, so hopefully that will go okay. Okay, so I have a little bit of a roadmap for what I want to talk about tonight. I'll talk a little bit about the current redistricting process for the congressional districts and then our state House and state Senate districts, and point out what some of the problems of those have been and the fixes that Fair Districts PA is supporting. And then give you a little bit of information about how you could, if you're interested in supporting Fair Districts, do so. So we're going to start with redistricting. When we're talking about redistricting, what we are redistricting is the voting district. So we all live in some place, and we live inside a congressional district, a congressional house district. We live inside of a state house district. We live inside of a state Senate district. And those district boundaries shift over time as the population changes. It all starts with the United States Constitution. So the Constitution says that each state is going to have 2 senators, and then there's going to be a total of 435 representatives that would be divided amongst the states according to the population size of the states. So what happens is that every 10 years, I'm going to just turn a little bit. That messes up. I feel like I'm doing a lot of this back and forth because I'm used to seeing where my, should we just turn this? Okay. All right, that's better. Technology, right? Okay, so now I can kind of look back and forth and see what's going on here. So the Constitution says that the representatives will be divided up amongst the states according to population sizes. And so in the United States, every 10 years, we have a census. And we look at the total population for the United States, and then what is the size of the population in each of the states. And that's used to determine then how many representatives each state will have. So this happens every 10 years, this reapportionment. And in that process, some states gain some representatives and some states lose some representatives. So we have some states like Florida and Texas, that are, the population is growing relative to the total size of the population in the United States. And then we have some other states like Pennsylvania where we're losing some population. So just to show you the pattern for Pennsylvania in the last couple of decades following the census, after the 1990 census, we had 21 representatives in Congress, and then in 2000, we dropped back to 19, and in 2010, we were given 18, and we're going to lose at least one after the 2020 census, maybe 2. We'll just have to see how that pans out. And so if you have the same size of state, but you have a different number of congressional representatives, then you have to redraw the lines. You either have to redraw the lines to get rid of one of the districts, or for the states who gain them, they have to redraw the lines to gain some representatives. Now, the Constitution doesn't say a whole lot about how that will happen. It just says it's up to the states. So there's not one consistent way that all of the states do reapportionment and redistricting of the congressional districts. In the state of Pennsylvania, the majority party, whatever the majority party is following the census, draws the map, and then they introduce it into the state legislature, much like they would introduce any bill. So you have both chambers that vote on the map, and then the governor has an opportunity to approve or to veto that. So that happens very much like a bill, which means that the politicians who stand to gain or lose are in charge of the process of drawing those district lines. Now, at the same time that the congressional districts are reapportioned across the states, that also generates redistricting of our state House districts and our state Senate districts to account for population shifts in the state. Maybe there's some areas that gain some more people and some that lose some people. And so we draw those lines as well. The state districts, the state Senate and state House districts are prepared by a redistricting commission that's made up of the 2 Democratic Party leaders and the 2 Republican Party leaders. So you have the House and Senate majority leader and the House and Senate minority leader, and then there's a 5th person. So there's four people that are in blue up there. They come together and they select who the 5th person will be that will chair the committee. And if they can't come to compromise, if they can't come to a decision on that, then the Supreme Court will appoint somebody who becomes the chair of that committee. This does not go to the floor of the legislature. There's no vote. The governor doesn't get a chance to approve or veto it. If someone doesn't like the map, they can take it to court. But this is not handled in the way that the congressional maps are, where there's a vote in the State House and Senate. The state constitution does not say a whole lot about this process, so I just have a couple passages here from our state constitution talking about the state districts. So we're going to have 50 Senate districts, and we are going to have 203 representative districts, which should be composed of compact and contiguous territory. Contiguous just means that, all the parts of a district would be connected to each other. You wouldn't have little islands, areas that would be part of the same district. And the Constitution of the state says that unless absolutely necessary, no county, city, incorporated town, borough, township, or ward will be divided to form a senatorial or a representative district. Okay, so what's the problem in all of this? Well, the problem is something that's called gerrymandering. And a lot of people don't know much about gerrymandering, but it seems like it's in the news all the time now, so we're all becoming experts on gerrymandering. I didn't really know much about it until I learned about fair districts, and I thought, oh, that's something that I could support. So now I'm learning about it. But the definition of gerrymandering is drawing boundaries to benefit some and disempower others. And in the process, you create majorities that would not otherwise exist. Now, gerrymandering is not new, as you can see from the little box here. It's been around since at least 1812, so it goes back to the early part of our history, where Governor Elbridge Gerry, his last name was actually Gary. It's actually gerrymandering, but it doesn't matter. Gerrymandering is fine too, that's what everybody says. But he drew a crazy shaped district, and somebody said, my goodness, that looks like a salamander. And someone else said, yes, like gerrymander. That was probably the beginning also of giving these weird names to these odd-shaped districts. So I want to look at some examples of gerrymandering, but what I want to start is with an example that is not gerrymandered. It's a competitive district. It's a little bit more fair for the people who live in there. So we've got a bunch of people here And if you counted the different colors here, you'd see that there's an equal number of red voters and there's an equal number of blue voters. And then there's some other voters mixed into this population. Maybe people registered as independents, libertarians, people in the Green Party. So we have a bunch of different kind of voters. And the way that the districts are drawn in this particular example, we get competitive districts because any candidate who's running to fill an office in these districts has to appeal to everybody. In any of these districts, if somebody doesn't appeal to those independent or third-party voters, then they're not gonna win the election, right? So in this situation, everyone has a voice, and candidates need to appeal to them all, and that's what democracy is all about, right? We all get a vote. Once we all vote, some of us win and some of us lose, but we expect for our vote to count for something. Now, what happens when gerrymandering occurs is that the lines are drawn in a way that doesn't really give everybody a voice. So here's just a couple of examples of gerrymandering. This is a kind of gerrymandering on the right side that sometimes is called a sweetheart deal or the partisan handshake. So you have some divisions where both of the two major parties set things up to ensure that their candidate will win. So if you lived in that bottom district there that has all the blue voters in it, and maybe you were an independent voter or you were a libertarian voter, your point of view and the things that you had to say might not really be taken into consideration very strongly. I'm going to make sure I don't not say anything. So in this situation on the right, elections are actually determined in the primary elections, right? So our two majority parties have primary elections. If you're not registered with one of those two majority parties, you don't get to participate in the primary. And so candidates in the primary need only appeal to the base of their party. They don't really need to appeal to anyone else. And so we have a couple of districts that are ensured that somebody who's in the red party will win, and we have another district where we're ensured that somebody in the blue party will win. And the middle district is actually competitive. Somebody running for office in that middle district on the right side would have to appeal to a diversity of voters in order to win the election. So that's actually competitive. Another kind of gerrymandering is called cracking. So this is where you have a group that has a pretty large number of people in the population, and you draw the districts to split up that group to take away some of their ability to win districts. So we actually have equal numbers of red voters and blue voters in these populations, but we end up with maybe 2 red districts and 1 blue district. Now, I'm just using these pictures that I got off of the internet that have red and blue on them, and they're organized in a particular way in these pictures, but let me tell you, both the blue party and the red party do this. Whenever they get a chance, they do this. So I don't mean to say this is one party or another. Another kind of gerrymandering is called packing. So in this situation, you are taking a lot of people who are registered with the same party, and you're just shoving all those people in one district so that they're not spread out and they don't have a voice, and people running for office in the remaining districts don't have to worry about those voters and appeal to what their concerns and their interests are. So I'm not going to, there's other kinds of gerrymandering, I guess you could go on and on about it, but the end result is that when you have packing, like on this slide, you're concentrating voters of one kind in a district, and when you have cracking, that previous slide, you're diluting people's voices. Excuse me. And that other sweetheart gerrymander, that partisan handshake, that's kind of like the two main parties getting together and saying, okay, one district for me and one district for you, and they're choosing their voters. When they draw the lines this way, they are choosing their voters instead of the voters in the district choosing who will represent their interests in Harrisburg or Washington, D.C. So this is a bit of a problem, and it's been around for a while, and people have considered it to be a fairly bad problem for a while as well. So we've got a former president, Ronald Reagan. He said that the problem is gerrymandering, the practice of rigging the boundaries of congressional districts, the greatest single blot on the integrity of our nation's electoral system. So even back in the 1980s, this was understood as a pretty serious problem. And as I've been learning about this, I learned just recently that the League of Women Voters actually started to be, maybe before, but I know that at least by the 1990s, the League of Women Voters was concerned about this problem of gerrymandering during the redistricting process. So it's been about a problem, but it seems to be getting worse. There have been studies lately that have tried to develop some metrics to assess the degree of gerrymandering in the maps of the states in the United States. And in one of these studies that was published in 2017, I've got a little reference to it at the bottom here, called Extreme Maps, Pennsylvania was declared to be the third worst gerrymandered state in the United States. And a lot of this has to do with that southeastern corner that I'm highlighting there. And in fact, Carol Conaholm, who is one of the founders of Fair District PA, is from District 7, which is the yellow district on the right-hand side there. So that yellow district has been given a couple of different names based on its shape. You got, what is it, Bullwinkle, or anyway.
Goofy.
The funniest one, though, I think I've got a little picture down there of Goofy kicking Donald Duck. So that seems to be the one that's captured people's imagination. But what that's done is, all those people that are in that district, they're not really they're in a contiguous district, but it's not really compact. And how can their representative really represent them very well? So, and gerrymandering, that District 7 down in the Westchester area around Philadelphia is the poster child of gerrymandering, maybe one of the worst. It's in a contest for one of the worst gerrymandered districts in the entire United States. But we have some gerrymandering up here in northwestern Pennsylvania also. Maybe our districts don't look as convoluted as they used to, but things have changed for Erie County. Up until after the 2010 census, Erie County has always been together. All the parts of Erie County have always been together in the same congressional district. We have even been able to have people from Erie run for Congress, and win those elections. But now, after 2010, Erie has been split in half. We've been split up a little bit. This has happened in our state maps as well. So if you look at Erie County on the current state representatives map, we've got a lot of slicing up of the central part of the county there. And you've got these other districts like way out in the West County, Park-Went Lakes District goes all the way down through past Mercer County. So that's a challenging district to represent. It's challenging for the voters, because when is your representative going to be in your local area so you can meet with them and talk to them? It's challenging for the representatives too. How do you make sure you're representing all your constituents in these far-flung districts? Gerrymandering overall, one of the overall results of gerrymandering is that it leads to less competitive races, and if people feel like their vote doesn't count, they drop out of the democratic process. So I've got some statistics here looking at a couple of different metrics, races that were run, races with incumbents in them, and of course incumbents are people who are currently in office and then they're running to be reelected in the next election. the number of incumbents who ran without primary challengers, and then races where there wasn't even any opposition running against those. So what this gerrymandering results in is having fewer primary candidates. It kind of favors incumbents. Incumbents are able to kind of, in Pennsylvania, run for office continually and raise money continually. And if the party likes the incumbent, they can make sure that that incumbent stays in office. So we actually have a little bit more incumbents running without even primary challengers than the overall country does. And then we've got a higher number of races that run uncontested, you know, where there's an incumbent and there's no primary challenger and there's no one from the opposite party. And this disenfranchises voters. If you live in one of those districts where the district is overwhelmed by a group registered with a particular party, then you can feel frustrated, like you have no voice, and then people feel like, what's the point, right? So we get poor voter turnout. So you're probably aware that there's greater voter turnout in those big years when there's a presidential candidate. A lot of people go to the polls. Maybe they just vote for the president. Maybe they vote, you know, across the whole ballot in those years. But we have very poor voter turnout in those off years where we have these gerrymandered districts, you know, with the incumbents, and so, and sorry, I lost my train of thought. So a lot of these, if there are primary challengers in these districts, our candidates, the people who go on to the general election ballot, are determined primarily by the party's base, for whatever that party is. So gerrymandering, it can cause some problems. It can make our government a little less functional for us. So, you know, who's representing our area and making sure that we get funding for our schools and our services and all that kind of stuff. If you're a business person, you know, where do you go? Who do you talk to get your problems dealt with? The question of whether or not a representative should try to represent everybody. We run into this problem of gridlock. Gridlock seems to me like it's gotten really extreme in the last couple of decades, where you have these two extremes of both of the major parties in office, and they're not willing to compromise and to work on things, and they kind of listen to what's going, they kind of listen to their bosses, you know, in the party, and are doing what the national level party people would like them to do, which isn't always the best thing for us in Pennsylvania. And then it also makes it hard for politicians who maybe would want to represent their constituents well to do so, because if you go against your party and you vote your conscience, then the next time redistricting comes around, they can draw you out of your district. So these are just some general sorts of things that kind of come up with our functioning, the functioning of our democracy and the functioning of our government in Pennsylvania. So things seem to have gotten more and more extreme. Gerrymandering has always been around. There's some literature on the back table there, and I think that there might be something, I think it's the piece of paper that has the green label along the top. On the back side of it shows the evolution of that funky shaped district down around Harrisburg over time, and you'll just see that over the decades, over a long period of time, that shape got more and more extreme, but it took on its very extreme shape in the last go-around of redistricting. So how did things get so bad? Why are things so bad in Pennsylvania? Well, one of the problems for us is that even though we're losing representatives, we're losing our population relative to the size of the population of the United States, we're still pretty big, we still have a lot of people, and we're actually pretty close to 50-50. We're pretty close to, you know, of people who are registered to vote and vote. We're not exactly 50-50, but we're close to 50-50. So we're a swing state, and that makes us attractive for outside money and outside attention. Another thing that has occurred lately that has really impacted this problem is that there's all this sophisticated data mining technology. We're always clicking on things on the internet, and we're buying things on the internet, and they're just able to follow us and map us, and so much information about ourselves is out there as digital data. So we've got this data mining technology, and then the mapping technology has gotten really sophisticated. So they can go into these computerized mapping environments, and they can see all of this, they can put on the map all of this socioeconomic data about people, and they can kind of use that to carve out exactly the voters and put the voters they want inside of some districts and put people in other places. So this technology has really played a big role in this. And then Pennsylvania has some pretty lax campaign finance laws. We probably need some reform in that area too, but there's no limits to PAC donations. There's no limits to lobbyist donations. There's no limits on funds that are raised by outside groups. And so these campaigns in the state become of interest to people outside of the state. And so both sides of the aisle pour a ton of money in, and we get all this sort of smear stuff in these groups misrepresenting what different politicians running for office say. It gets really bad around election times when all this money is coming in there. And that has to do with the fact that some of our campaign financing laws have changed on a lot of levels. So when Citizens United case was determined, right, that really allowed a lot of money to come into our elections. So it sort of takes away the voice of local people when what local people are trying to figure out and campaign for is swamped by all these outside interests. So these are the problems as Fair District sees it. Gerrymandering is a big problem, and what Fair Districts would like to see is for the state constitution to be changed in a way that would allow an independent redistricting commission to draw the district lines. They see this process as being one that would be a little bit more transparent and give opportunities for the public to comment and participate. So Fair Districts PA is supporting two bills that are nearly identical. One is a Senate bill, SB 22, and one is a House Bill 722 that would basically create an impartial citizens redistricting commission. I just have a list of the primary sponsors, and then what Fair Districts is trying to do is to get people to learn about this issue, and if you think that it's an important issue, to get in touch with your legislators and see if they're supporting these bills as well. So we've got a complicated table here that asks some questions about the process in the far left-hand column. Who draws the lines? Who's responsible for that? What are the data that would be used to draw the lines? And the third question is, how transparent is this process to the public? The middle column gives us some information about the current process. I've talked about some of those things already. And then the far right-hand column indicates, just summarizes what these Senate bill and House bills that Fair Districts PA is supporting would try to do. So the Fair District, the bills that Fair Districts is supporting would set up an 11-person independent citizens commission. Now, people would volunteer to be on that commission. The legislators, if these amendments were passed, then there would have to be some follow-up bills where the legislators would determine what criteria would qualify people or disqualify people to be on that committee. But there would be qualifications and disqualifications, but if you wanted to be on that redistricting committee and you were qualified to do so, then your name would go into a hat, basically. And when it came time to create the commission, they would pull out the names of 4 people who were registered with the Republican Party. there would be some criteria such as it had to be someone who voted in at least the most recent 2 elections. There would be some other criteria also just to make sure that not, people who were not qualified were not getting on the committee, but there would be 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and then 3 people drawn from the pool of voters who were registered as independents or with some other kind of third party in Pennsylvania. And there would be an effort to make that districting commission reflect better the diversity of the state. Also, it doesn't say it on here, so this might come up as a question, so I'll just say that at least 7 people out of those 11 would have to agree with the map for it to move forward, and there would have to be at least 1 person from each of those groups, Republicans, Democrats, and other voters, out of those 7 who would agree. In the current process, they use some information like party registration, voting frequency, maybe some other socioeconomic data has been used for some regions. The proposed bills would limit the information to just the current population size. So there might be some geographic concerns that would be taken into consideration so that we're not dividing communities that really should be together. But it just will be looking at the map and where do people live and making districts that had equal sizes of population inside those districts. So you could end up with a majority of voters of one particular party in a district. Of course that's going to happen, but you wouldn't be looking at that information in advance and using that to draw your lines. And then as far as transparency to the public goes, the current process does not require any transparency for the public, but the HB 722 and SB 22 would create opportunities for public hearings and public participation. These bills are requesting us to start a process where we are changing the state constitution, and it's very difficult it's just a long, involved process to change the state constitution, and we're really just at the beginning of that. So the first thing that has to happen is if we're going to have these amendments to the Constitution in place in time for redistricting following the 2020 election, then we need to get one of these bills passed in either the State House or the State Senate. Currently, both of those bills are being held up in the state government committee. So these involve state government. They've been written. There's many co-sponsors. I'll give you some data about that shortly. And yet they're still stuck in the committee. The leadership of those committees will not bring those bills off the table where they can have a hearing and be voted on by the committee and go to the floor for debate and then pass to the other chambers. So all of this has to happen by the end of the current legislative session. So I feel kind of hopeful about this because they are good bills, they are fair bills, they are just asking for us to have a democratic process that's fair to all people. So we have a lot of hope that this will get through in this session. Then all of this has to happen again in the next legislative session, because to change the state constitution, you have to have an affirmative vote in both the State House and the State Senate in 2 consecutive legislative sessions. If we get to that point, then a public referendum would go on to the election ballot in November of 2020, and then we would be in a situation where the citizens would be in charge of that process. We would have that independent committee, and we would be choosing our representatives, again, instead of our representatives choosing the voters. So that's a lot of work to change that process, but Fair Districts PA started as a program in late 2016, working with some of those legislators who were the main sponsors on the bill, and they've been working very hard throughout the state to bring awareness to it and asking people to contact their legislators if they're interested in this. And to date, I just checked the numbers to be sure I had the right numbers before I came this evening. There is a very simple majority of House co-sponsors now. We have 102 out of 203. That is both Republicans and Democrats. It's more Democrats than Republicans, but there's a healthy number of Republican co-sponsors as well. We have 16 out of 50 Senate co-sponsors, and communities throughout the state have been asking their municipalities and other government entities to pass resolutions asking for support of these bills. And as I said before, for some of our problems, those bills right now are trapped in the state government committee. And it's also a problem, some people perceive this to be a partisan issue, but it's actually a non-partisan issue. Gerrymandering is done by whatever the majority party is that's in power, and just one of the two majority parties happens to be in power right now, but when it's the other party, they do the same thing, right? And what's new really is all of this sophisticated mapping technology and data mining technology, and the other party would probably do the same thing if they're in power if things aren't changed, right? So this is just changing things to make things more fair in Pennsylvania, to make people have more faith in government, local government, well, state government, and that their vote counts. So some of the things that we would hope that you would do if it seems like a issue that you could support is we do have a petition, I believe, on the back table. So you could sign that petition. There's also petitions online. You could go to fairdistrictspa.com. They've got a lot of information, a little bit more detail than I've talked about here tonight, but they've got a very well designed website that lays everything out for you, and you could get access to an online petition if you wanted to look at things more closely before you sign things. I always like to read things carefully before I put my signature on them. We're asking people to contact their state senators and their state representatives to tell them this is an important issue. If it is, you can find out from the Fair Districts PA website, or we could even tell you here tonight if your representative or senator was a co-sponsor or not. If your representative or senator is not a co-sponsor, if you could contact them, maybe talk to them on the telephone, or even better, visit their office and ask them, tell them it's important to you and co-sign, you could do that. If they have co-signed, you could thank them for co-signing, because there's a little bit of a political risk involved in signing that legislation. And it also, involves giving up a little bit of power and control back to the people, right? So that's a little bit of a risk as well. People could write letters to the editor. We have a Fair Districts PA Erie County chapter, so you could get involved with that chapter. There's a lot of different sorts of volunteer activities that you could do. I heard Carol Conahom, one of the founders of Fair Districts, speak about this in April, and I really didn't know much about it at all before then, but I was so moved. I thought, people need to know about this, and I could volunteer to do something. What could I do? And I thought, well, I am a professor. I do speak for a living. I'm not an expert on politics and fair districts. I'm a little just here as a citizen tonight, but I can speak in front of people. That's a little scary thing for other people, but not all the volunteers speak. There's other kind of roles as well. Now, one last thing I just want to talk about, because it's been in the news so much, is you may be aware that there was a court case against the congressional districts map that went through the court system in the state and has gone all the way up to the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court. So I made a slide here just with some information about this. This is really recent news, and so it's probably fresh if you've heard about it on the news, but basically the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court told Harrisburg they need to redraw the congressional district map, that it's unfair as it's drawn right now. This just affects the congressional map. The lawsuit was only about the congressional map. It doesn't affect the state districts, for the Senate districts or the House districts. And there's a pretty short timeline for this. So the court said that the new map has to be approved by February 15th, and that the General Assembly and the governor have to agree on the map. And if the General Assembly won't put a map together that the governor is willing to approve, then this is going to go to the Supreme Court, and they're going to make a map. That's kind of where it stands right now. And I think, from Fair District's PA point of view, this is really just kind of a Band-Aid. I mean, this is a court case that is separate from Fair Districts. I'm just mentioning it right now because it's very much in the news, but Fair Districts PA is not involved in that court case, and we feel that if we redraw that map, whatever happens with that, that doesn't fix the whole problem. And so after we have the census in 2020, who knows what's going to happen in the 2018 elections and the 2020 elections. We don't know who is going to be in charge of drawing that map in 2020, but both majority parties have a history of drawing gerrymandered maps. So we really need to get this legislation passed in these 2 consecutive sessions so that we can change the process. The states that have an independent redistricting commission don't have such a problem with gerrymandered districts. They don't come out as gerrymandered in those states. Another thing that's been in the news, mention this too, is that there's also an amendment to the state constitution to downsize the size of the House of Representatives in the state from 203 members to 151. And that was passed in both chambers last session, and it's just come off the table now. So it's not up for a vote yet, but that will probably be voted for this session. And if we change the size of the House of Representatives without changing the redistricting process, we're still going to have this same problem also. So there is some effort amongst some of the people who have co-sponsored the bills to create an independent redistricting committee to work on amendments to this bill that would make it happen after redistricting, or somehow would tie redistricting to the process. So Fair Districts doesn't really have an opinion on the size of the legislature, the House of Representatives, but would like to see this redistricting reform occur before that downsizing occurs. So that's kind of where I'm at with my slides. So I'm finished. If we want to have a conversation, we could do that. Yeah.
If the state courts rule on this, does that take effect with the 2018 election?
It would.
Wow.
Yeah, it's yeah. There's some logistical stuff about that, especially with people right now who are throwing their hats in the ring to run. Yeah, but it's a pretty abbreviated timeline. Yeah.
If we go down from 203 to 151, will that not be a savings in terms of finances?
Yeah, well, it would be less money because I think they make something like upwards of, I don't know what, the 87,000 a year in a pension and that. So the less people, but it's not going to change. It's not going to change the gerrymandering. Instead of having smaller gerrymandered districts, we'll have larger gerrymandered districts. And so it's a cost savings, and we don't have an opinion on it, that's up for public debate. Fair Districts is a one-issue organization, so, we could debate the merits of that, and certainly it's being proposed for that reason, to reduce the costs of government in Harrisburg. But we need to have redistricting reform tied to it or occurring before that would take place. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for a very enlightening session. However, I'd like to understand a little bit more about what you're proposing to correct this problem. And then on those principles, how is that going to be applied to the reduction in federal congressional districts? Because Pennsylvania is going to lose population, is going to lose some seats. And also for that forced state legislature seats.
I'm sorry, what was the last bit?
How are you going to apply those principles? When you,
Well, so Fair Districts, this is
you
just,
haven't said the principles, so I'd like you to tell me the principles.
okay,
Of how
so,
you're going to achieve that, and how you're going to apply to the congressional districts as well as to
okay,
the
so,
state legislature.
okay, so this independent districting commission of 11 people here that would include 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 3 people registered in another way, they would draw all the maps.
But those are the composition of your commission.
I don't
It does
understand.
not tell me how they're going to, or how you will, your organization,
Well, if the
do that.
The committee would, when the committee is formed, they would select their methodology and they would make that information available. But these bills are not prescribing a particular methodology. So the methodology to make the maps would be adopted by that 11-person commission, and there is opportunities for transparency and public involvement and comment during that process. But the actual process is not prescribed within those amendments to the state constitution. The state constitution, the amendment that we're talking about would primarily impact the constitution of the redistricting commission. It would say, instead of having legislators who have a vested interest in the outcome of the process make the decision, what we're going to do is try to create a redistricting commission that's independent from politics. I was trying to figure out if that was the right word.
In other words, since we don't have that commission,
It's not independent right
4
now.
R's, 4 D's, 3 others, we don't have it. So, we don't have a principle of how to do that, and these 11 people are unknown.
Right,
Which
that-
means we're still in an unknown territory.
Isn't it true, though, that that the Constitution does say that you have to have, I don't know if it specifies how many people, but that each district has to have a particular, generally the same number of people in each district?
Approximately equal.
Yeah, so there are criteria for whoever does it. They have to have a certain number of people, it has to be pretty much the same in every group, and they have to be contiguous and ideally compact, which they have to be.
The amendments do not state what would qualify someone to be on the committee. And maybe that's what, I'm having a little trouble understanding what your concern is. The amendments do not say what the qualifications would be. That would be something that if the amendment was passed, then it would be up to the legislature to then flesh all of that out. So Fair Districts was told not told, but you don't want to overwrite the bill and add too much detail into the bill, because all bills are worked on and amended. So you could have a vote on the bill, and there's still some modifications, you know, that are made to it as they go along. So those criteria that would qualify people to be in that pool would be determined later. I don't know if you're satisfied with my answer or not. I might just be having trouble understanding what you're asking me.
Well, I think the main point is that you're taking the districting process out of the hands of politicians and putting it in the hands of the citizens. So if you're going to be on that independent council, you know, you're not going to be an elected official, you're not going to be related to an elected official. There's some, do you remember some of the other ones, Karen?
Well, I think you couldn't have been a lobbyist for, nobody who's been a professional lobbyist for the previous 5 years. Just trying to take vested interest out of the process. Not just putting any old person like me who knows really nothing about it. You know, I wouldn't be qualified to be on that committee, but there are people throughout the state who would have the qualifications and the interest to do that. So not just putting anybody, it's not just a lottery where we would just, like the jury, it's not like the jury selection, right? Where, you know, if your number comes up, you gotta go in there and maybe end up on the jury.
Well, let me see if I understand this. While we won't know all of the ways in which these two proposals would work out in redistricting, we do know what it gets rid of. And what it gets rid of is districts being divided by party registration, voting frequency, socioeconomic levels, age, level of education. All of that will no longer be able to be looked at in terms of dividing districts. It will be based on population and not splitting up cities and counties like is happening now, and drawing all these weird shapes in order to get it that way. Is that what you're?
Yeah,
That-
just
that's
to
what your
take
chart-
some of the bias out of the process.
I mean,
To
that's what your chart
depoliticize, to try
is
to
saying.
depoliticize the process. And, you know, if you wanted to, you could keep your eye on the process, right? Because there are opportunities for public involvement in the process.
I mean, I don't want to misread that, but that's what your chart is saying, basically, correct?
Yeah, more or less.
Oh.
Yeah, so, I mean, there are other states that have independent districting committees where the district lines are not drawn by the politicians who stand to gain something from them. And when they've used these new metrics, there's a couple of different metrics they've used to try to evaluate whether gerrymandering has occurred. There seems to be less of that problem in those states where the districts are drawn by an independent commission. Yeah.
Would the same commission, assuming that these two bills pass, would the same commission do both state and federal, or would it be two different ones?
Nope, just one commission would do the maps.
For both,
Mhm.
state and federal?
Mhm. Yeah, I have them on the same line there. So in the current process, we've actually got two different processes. As I mentioned at the beginning, that for the congressional districts, you know, those are introduced by the majority party as a bill, whereas the state districts, there's this districting commission that, you know, doesn't submit their maps as they would for a bill. So that's a little different here, but both of these proposals would just make the same commission responsible for all of those maps. Yeah.
As the districts are drawn now, do they currently have about the same population per district, even though
They must,
they look weird?
yes,
Okay.
they must.
That's
So-
the fundamental.
Roughly the same. You know, yeah. It's a hard and imperfect process. You know, where to put the lines is, it's imperfect. But things can be imperfect without being grossly unfair. And not every district in the state is grossly unfair, but there are some very grossly fair districts. And you know, it's hard for representatives as well. It can be hard for representatives as well, you know. Any other comments or hard
Good luck.
questions?
Just say good luck.
Well, hopefully, we have some materials on the back table if you wanted to take anything with you. One of them has a chart on that's very similar to this, maybe has a little bit more detail on it than I have on the slide, so you could grab one of those and look over the chart if you wanted to.
Are those same things that you have back there, are they also on the website?
No, we have these things that were printed. The information is on the website, but it's not on the website in the same form as the handouts. The website's very good though, and that's fairdistrictspa.com. I think these are good bills. I mean, I don't know. I'm just motivated as an independent voter. I just have had this growing sense of frustration throughout my adult life that things have gotten, you know, we've had these two parties that have just moved farther and farther away from the center towards the extremes to the point where they can't compromise. When I go to Thanksgiving dinner, I'm not sure who I can talk to around the table. I have to be careful, you know, what I'm talking about. And I grew up in Pennsylvania. I'm from York, which is south of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And, you know, I've always found Pennsylvania to be this sort of really interesting political mix anyway, because I, you know, grew up with very Christian, fiscally conservative parents who were union members, you know, so like things in other places that wouldn't go together very well. But I don't know, my sense, I'm not very political. I haven't even gotten that involved in politics till recently, but I've just been so frustrated with how separate things have been, and I feel like our last presidential election was just a lot of people being frustrated with the system and feeling like wherever they were living, they didn't have like a voice and a say in that. And so people have been trying to change the gerrymandering problem for a long time. It's as Carol Conaholm, one of the founders of Fair Districts, would say, it's kind of a wonky issue, you're right? That people are like, oh, that's not very interesting. I don't want to talk about that. But we are in a moment in history right now in the United States where maybe the door is open to kind of get back to basics again. And I think that a lot of people, for good or for ill, are getting involved in politics, right? And so that's what we really want in a democracy. Democracy is a little bit messy. We all kind of get together and we argue about stuff. But, you know, we should all have a voice in that discussion. So I think...
there's one more thing. There was a request to announce the Jefferson.
Oh, thank you. I forgot about that. So I'm just a volunteer speaker, but Carol Conaholm, who's one of the founders of the organization, is speaking Thursday next week, February 18th. It's late at night. I've been up since 5 working. Sorry, let me start over. So she's going to be at the Jefferson next Thursday, February 8th. What is the time that begins? 7?
7 to 8:30.
7 to 8:30. She will be joined by a professor from Penn State Barron, who's a little bit more of an expert on politics and gerrymandering than I am. Robert Steele. Robert Steele. And she is an excellent speaker and would also be able to answer questions perhaps a little bit better if you wanted to go to that event. It is free and open to the public. I think you need to either call the Jefferson and go to their webpage, and you can register for a couple of free tickets that you can pick up at the box office.
Just so that you know what's happening, this afternoon I tried to register and it said, wait, there are 23 people ahead of you. So I think they're going to have a really good turnout.
Oh, good. Good.
Yeah, I'm not even going to register, I'm just showing.
Thank you very much. Next month will be